Just got a couple of notes I made before we start right into page 83. The growth of atheism is truly remarkable. It's growing all over the world. I did mention this before, one of the classes, I'll just mention it again, that a gentleman came from Europe when I was at the University of Ottawa. He's a philosopher there, well known. He came in and said that philosophy in Europe is dead today. And an American on the faculty said, well, why are you here if it's dead? Because his lecture was all in French, and he said, je suis ici pour les funèbres. We're here for the funeral. Pour les tâches funèbres, etc. It's treated with, so religion is treated with some contempt, such as on TV. A lot of contemptuous remarks made on TV. Waiting for God, that session, for instance, it was always, religion was put on the defensive, as it were. Some years ago, Moscow Radio broadcasting and was rebroadcast by CKO in Canada. And once in a while, I used to like CKO, but they had this broadcast in which a man would read a question out that somebody had asked, and a woman would reply, if I remember correctly, in that order. And she said, I think somebody said, you people are atheists in Russia. She said, nobody can prove there is a God, and nobody can prove there's not a God. But the more you learn about science, the less you'll worry about a God, or think about a God. That's what they said. I wrote to them, as a matter of fact, to the station, and I said, that's a lot of rubbish. Men have been able to prove the existence of God, even with ordinary common sense, even, for probably many thousands of years, but recorded going back 26 centuries. Now today, the trouble is in Western civilization is that there's a superficial treatment of the 5 ways in student textbooks. It's appalling what they do. They try to make a sort of a logical fallacy out of the thing, out of the proofs of the existence of God. Remember, St. Thomas calls his 5 ways the proof of the existence of God. They're really 5 ways of saying the fundamental proof, and we'll see that as we go along. But the ignorance about these proofs and the reality of our dependence on God is extraordinary. What comes after death? An important question. I said that to a woman living in Lewiston here on the phone. Living in St. Catharines, Ontario, just recently, within the last 2 or 3 years. I said, I'm very concerned about the state of affairs and what comes after death today with the people, etc. She said, we can't be bothered with questions like that. You shouldn't think about those things. Good God, the only thing worth thinking about, ultimately. You never hear about any of these things from the pulpit. That's the part that worries me most. Never. Coming from the pulpit. I'm trying to find a communication I had from the New Oxford Review, in which they mentioned this, about the cowardly action of certain people that should know better. If the atheists examined the proofs and had difficulty with them, then I would understand. But they don't, they just sidestep them. But to ignore them is unforgivable, especially by scholars who know better. Well, they're just a few preliminary notes I wanted to make, remarks I wanted to make. I think you got that page today. When I'm printing up these notes, I do spell checks, I do all sorts of things, and boy, they miss the most obvious spelling errors sometimes. But something came out, I think it was page 101, was it? Yes, 101 today. It even changed the margin. You know, I think this explains it all. To err is human, but to really mess things up requires a computer. So first of all now, what do we have to do to prove the existence of a first cause of all reality? These 5 ways we're going to examine in detail. We'd have to show, though, something around us, something we can observe, and then proceed to something we cannot observe. That's exactly what St. Paul said in the first letter to the Romans, chapter 20. He said we can know the invisible things from the things that he has made. So we can know the existence of God from the things around us. My 2 friends, Paul Lagadec and André Dupont, classmates of mine in Montreal, one said, how can you prove something, an infinite being, from concrete things around us? Well, what do they share? Existence. And we'll see how you can do it. So what we've got to do, you see, there are 2 ways of proving something in logic. You can argue from the cause to the effect, or from the effect to the cause. And they're given Latin names, by the way. A priori, meaning from a prior, if you like. That's from the cause to the effect. Well, obviously we can't do that. We'd have to know God. Know him to argue from the cause. So you can't prove his existence by knowing him. You'd be the 4th person of the Trinity, perhaps. The other one's called a posteriori. That's reasoning from effect back to cause. So it's obviously what we've got to do is reason from the effects back to cause. Then what we have to do, we have to show that some things around us are effects. We can't make an assumption of that. We have to show they are effects. And the first thing we have to understand is that the whole reality around us makes a lot of sense, much more than we realize. I heard a physicist in a lecture one night said, one thing that puzzles me is why is everything in the solar system, why is it all so reasonable? Why does it all constantly operate according to laws? Couldn't understand that. Why do rose bushes always have roses and not tulips? Why do cats have kittens and not puppies, etc.? But there's always a regularity around us. And physical laws, the laws of physics, can be formulated because of observation of those things which regularly happen. So obviously there is some rationality in all of this. So we look at a hot spoon. There's an example there on page 83. We can argue from this effect that since spoons appear sometimes with heat and sometimes without heat, heat's not essential to the nature of spoon. So it acquires that heat. It's something added to its nature. We call that an accident. Accident means it befalls something. People often say, oh, it's not an accident that there's heat in the spoon. Well, that's not what we mean by that's something that happens to the spoon too. If you have an accident, something happens to you. Well, it's something that happens to the spoon. It befalls or befits or comes to the spoon. It's not the spoon itself, but it comes to it. So the heat is either from the spoon itself or from another. But since sometimes it's without heat, therefore it's not from the spoon itself. We see destruction in a china shop. We say that, oh, there's been a bull in here. Then later things are made tidy and cleaned up and everything put back with price tickets on again. You don't say, been another bull here. So order demands reason. Order demands intellect. Now when I say reason and then I correct myself and say intellect, God doesn't reason. We reason. God knows instantly without reasoning. Because we have to, because our minds are so weak. We can only put little blocks of reality together. The sky is blue. Well, we put sky and we put blue together. Then we want to reason, we find, oh, that's because, why? Because it's filtered in the atmosphere. We have to go through all this reasoning process. God knows it in a flash. So there's a difference between intellection and reasoning. There are 3 acts of the human intellect. First we grasp something, sky. Then another something, blue. Then another something, filtration. That's the first act of the intellect. The next act of the intellect is we judge. For instance, I might have this in the first act, book, thing on the table. But then we put together those two in a judgment and say the book is on the table. In other words, the book is the thing which is on the table. So what we've got to do is to find a proper cause. We say being a bull in the china shop. It may have been little Johnny with a baseball bat. It may not have been a bull. Then we say things came together, and if we believe some modern physicists, all we've got to do is shake the shop up and it'll all fall back into place again, which is utterly foolish. I told you about the monkeys, didn't I? The monkeys, if they had sufficient number of monkeys with typewriters, they'd end up typing out the Bible. That sort of thing I've heard suggested in various ways. You know, and the supervisor suddenly looks over one monkey's, hey Joe, I think we got something up here, number 135. To be is not to be. That is the cue, yep, chop bump. So, in other words,
No cigar.
but
Back to the drawing board.
excuse me. So what we've got to do is to find an effect which we must discover in things around us. So each one of these proofs is going to begin with a fact, an observable fact. Now there are two ways we can make a judgment about facts. One is an empirical fact and the other is a philosophical fact. For instance, are there squirrels in, say, in Niagara Falls? I'll put it in the form of a judgment. There are squirrels in Niagara Falls. That's an empirical fact. Empirical had to be observed. The only way you could know it. You can't go to a chemistry book and discover that. You can't go to a mathematics book and discover it. Observation is the only way. Now, the other way starts in observation too, but it's a different kind of a fact. Beauty exists. That's a philosophical fact. Truth exists. Healing exists, if you like. How do I know? Beauty exists. There's one there. There's one there. There's one there. We've only got 3 women here tonight. Well, they're all beautiful anyway. Did somebody say there was a cup of coffee for me?
Shortly, Father.
Thank you. So, but we've got to find something which is a proper cause. Something which is a cause that'll produce that effect and properly produces that effect. Furthermore, we have to show that God is now, not that he was. Does he still exist? You see some outline about that, page 83. So here's the proofs in general. We're going to show that the greater cause has produced in a lesser effect. We're going to argue from the lesser and argue to the greater. We can exist to the existence of the greater from knowing the lesser. Contemporary philosophers speak of 3 proofs. Ontological, that is to say, the ontological way, we'll examine that in a minute. Cosmological and teleological. Teleological means from teleos in Greek, meaning the end. We argue from the end. Finality. We'll examine that. Cosmological, well, that's a sort of a group name for those proofs which are dealing with the world around us. Ontological comes from just our minds thinking. What's the greatest thing I can think about? I think we mentioned that last week, didn't we? The greatest thing I can think about. And resulting from that, I conclude there has to be a God. Well, we'll see St. Anselm's words themselves. We start off from 5 facts. Apply 5 proper principles, apply a common principle, and deduce 5 conclusions. Then we'll draw them all together. Now the proper principles, thank you. the proper principles, they are all modes of causality, the principle of causality. They're all some mode of it. The common principle is a consequence of those modes of causality. So we'll examine them. There are 5 ways, not truly 5 proofs or demonstrations. So the first way, and I'm going to let my hair down now and deal with that good and proper. I've put the gist of the proof there, but I want to go straight to the proof, the first way itself, and get into that. It starts off with this obvious fact. Remember the facts, the 5 facts for the 5 ways are 5 weaknesses in the world around us. And this way, the first way deals with movement. That's a weakness of everything. Nothing moves itself. Things have to be moved. There are 4 ways a thing can be moved. For instance, there's local movement. Here I am, going across like here. Aristotle defined movement as the act of the potential as it is potential. What am I saying? Here I'm walking. I'm only potentially there. I'm actually here, but potentially there. Now I'm the potential. Acting as a potential. Here I am, in act, yet still only potentially there. So that brilliant definition of Aristotle's, the act of the potential as it is potential, was interpreted by a Christian brother in Australia as have come, will travel. Remember Paladin? Have gun, will travel? Yes. Have come, will travel. So there are 4 ways that movement can exist. There's substantial movement. In other words, chemical changes. Or when you eat a steak, for instance, what you eat today walks and talks tomorrow, you know? And that's a substantial movement, a substantial change, if you like. Then there's local movement, the one I just demonstrated. Then there's qualitative movement, when things get hotter, etc., and quantitative. I think we'll have to change this little writer. And quantitative movement. They're the 4 modes of movement. Things qualitative, that's meant, qualitative is here. Qualitative is, for instance, he's a lad, he's just going along, now suddenly he's very happy. That's a quality change. Or when you've developed something in the mind, you've understood. That's quantitative, yes. Quantitative is when something gets bigger or smaller. That's a movement. Local movement from place to place. Latin locus, meaning place. Substantial, when some chemical change takes place, such as nutrition or chemical reaction, metal rust, all that sort of thing. So it starts out from the proof with that. And we understand, we develop from that there is a principle. Whatever undergoes movement is moved by another. Somebody press that, please. Whatever undergoes movement is moved by another. Now, I want to explain something about this. This has been drastically misunderstood. There's a reason for it. Originally, all of this was taught in Latin. I have the textbooks at home, the great books at home of St. Thomas in Latin, and Gret, and half a dozen others, Macquart in Latin, and it looks beautiful till somebody translates it. Quid movetur ad alio movetur. Now you'd think that's the same word. Movetur. It's not, they're 2 different words. But lots of people ignorant of these languages do not understand that, and they translate it into English and translate it falsely. People have often said, whatever is moved by another. It's a wrong translation. It's all right, you can use that if you know what it really means. What it means is whatever undergoes movement is moved by another. This is what is called middle voice. We have it in English in a different way, the French have it in another way, etc. If I said, for instance, I'm cutting some timber, and I'd say, oh, this timber cuts well. Timber doesn't cut at all, it's the saw that's doing the cutting. If I were to say this timber can be cut well, that's a passive voice. One's active, one's passive. But there's a middle way. It's neither active nor passive. It's called the middle voice. That is to say, it sort of stands back from both. And you'll say this lumber or timber cuts well, or this butter spreads well, or something else. But that's middle voice. It's neither active nor passive. That's what this is, the first movetur. The second movetur is passive. Whatever undergoes movement, is a good translation, is moved by another. So they say, oh, that's merely what they call a tautology. I've heard this said, that's merely a tautology. It doesn't say anything. Yes, it does. It says a lot. If anything is undergoing the moving, there's something moving it. We'll come back to that in just a second. So what we're going to do is talk about the movement. And the movement, we'll examine that shortly. But the principles of reason, there are two of them. On page 83, you've got it. 85, I'm sorry. Whatever undergoes movement is moved by another. The second one is, in a series of essentially subordinated movers, there's no infinite regress. And we've got to keep in mind potency and act. So now I'll draw this together and we'll watch it develop, unfold. You know, Fulton Sheen used to do a lot of broadcasting. I wasn't in this country then. We always had a little fairy or something. Did he to clean the board for it? An angel, that was it. Jenna, why aren't you up here? Let's take a movement. Now we're going to really start on this. Let's take a movement. Hand moves a stick to move a stone. Sorry, I'm not a good writer on the board. These make it much better with a chalk too, by the way. Hand moves a stick to move a stone. Now, what have we got here? The stone goes from potency to act. The stick goes from potency to act. The hand goes from potency to act. Now, remember what we said about potency and act. Potency isn't just a small act. It's not an act at all. It's not moving. Potency means lack of act. Something that's little child sitting under a tree, and you say he's potentially a mathematician. Well, there's another fellow sitting next to him, somebody, Archimedes or somebody, who's a mathematician. He's actually a mathematician. The child is only potentially a mathematician. Yet, as Aristotle pointed out, he's got a greater potentiality to be a mathematician than the puppy sitting next to him, which has no potentiality at all. But what we've got to look at is the hand is applying its act. No potency can actualize itself. Because if it could, that meant it had before it had what it's going to get. It doesn't make sense. A thing can't be in potency and act according to the same. The hand has to provide the act to the stick. The stick has to provide the act to the stone. So each depends on the one before it. Or you can say, yes, the hand provides something which is special to the hand. Yes. The stick provides something which is special to the stick. Yes. The stone provides something to the movement which is special to the stone. Stones roll over the way hands don't roll. But we're not worried about that. All we're worried about is this movement, the actualizing of the potential. So potency can be a little bit different in each. Like the potency in the puppy, in the dog, and in Archimedes. There's a different kind of a potency. But we're not worried about all that. What we're worried about is this moves from potency to act This moves from potency to act. This moves from potency to act. Now what we call this is a moved mover. That's the last one. A moved mover, the stone. But the stick is a moved to move mover. Am I writing big enough? You can read that, can you? Try and make it a little bigger. So that's a move to move mover. This stone is a moved. Oh, I should have put that down here, where the act is. It's a mover that was moved in order to move. The stick was moved to move, like the stone, but it's also a mover of the stone. So it's a move to move mover. Now the hand is a mover, and it's moved to move. I've had students say to me, you only say there's a God because you don't know what comes after the hand. Try me. The hand is moved by the muscle by the nerves by the locomotive power by the sensitive appetite by the imagination by the will. And there's only a limited number of things in the body. We don't have an infinite series. That can't exist. That's absurd. So therefore, we go back. How many are there between the first mover? We don't know. There could be billions, there could be none. We can't be utterly sure of that. But at least, move to move movers must have an ultimate mover. So the first principle, there it is. Whatever undergoes movement is moved by another. Now, we can't have an infinite series of movers. Can anybody tell me why not? Can anybody give me a reason why not? What if everything was moved? Infinite series. You'd have an infinite series of everything receiving. Nothing can account for the movement in itself. They're all receiving, but nothing giving it. Now you've got a greater problem with that than with anything. An infinite series of all receiving the movement and nothing giving it. You've got the greater coming out of the lesser. That's always absurd. So I've said to students, have you got a $100 note in your pocket, $100 in your pocket? No. Well, give it to yourself and you'll have $100 then. So nothing can give itself what it hasn't got. If they're all receivers and receiving it from nothing, now you've got absurdity. You have to have something giving for things to receive. If you can just grasp this one statement fully, meditate on that the stick is a move to move mover, and all those above it are move to move movers. Aristotle, 25 centuries ago, concluded there must exist an unmoved mover. First, yeah. Lots of people have had trouble in the modern world concluding that's a God. They didn't examine it far enough. We'll say more about that later. You can call it what you like. But it's an unmoved mover. Got no potency to be moved. And anything we do is a movement. So something gives the movement and isn't moved. So in any area whatsoever, it's not dependent on something. So it has to have all perfection in it. We'll come back to that. Now, as I said, it's an unmoved mover. But it depends on this essential characteristic, that it's all receiving from that upon which it's dependent. It must be utterly and essentially dependent upon that. What about if it's not some movement that's not essentially dependent? Let's have a look at some. I think we've got enough space here. Say the cogs in a car. I don't think I could draw cogs somehow. I'll try. all the cogs in the wheels, the gears, etc., everything pushing something else, all pushing. There's utter dependence in movement in those things. We could call the intermediate ones push-to-push pushers, if you like. I'd push that pretty hard. So, there's cogs. What about this one? Stairs. Stairs are essentially dependent upon the one below them to support those above them. Each stair is supported, those above it, because it's supported by the ones below it. That's essential dependence, or is it? Yes, of course it is essential dependence. Then there's another type. Let's take a train, for instance. Now here we are, we've got the engine here, we've got the carriages here. Carriage number 1 is pulled by carriage number 2, which is pulled by carriage number 3. Oh, sorry. I forgot something. Now we're right. It's got steam up, it's ready to go. So what happens here? The intermediate ones are pullmen. Pushmen, sorry. Pull to,
Say that fast 3 times.
yes, I'm trying. Pullers. That was a slip of the tongue, actually.
Pullman cars.
Yeah, Pullman cars, yes. So that's essential dependence. Not for its existence, not for the existence, not for the passengers, but simply for the pulling. Likewise here. The stone is not dependent on the stick for its existence, or for its shape, or anything else. It's dependent upon that for the movement only. That's the essential dependence. Likewise, with the cogs, there's essential dependence, and you know what happens if one stops or one breaks. You're in trouble. There's pushing up to a certain point. After that, one is pulled out, finished. Now the same here. If you take the stick away, the stone doesn't get moved. Or you might find another stick or move it by your hand. But it still has utter dependence upon something which is actually moving to give it the movement. Now, these are all essential dependence. The train, the stairway, and the cogs. Good examples of which I've put in the text for you. Now let's look at one which is not essential. And did I have trouble with students in Ottawa at this? Particularly as I had 2 classes packed with nurses. Never was I faced with so many beautiful people and beautiful women in all my life as I had there. And they came back for graduate courses. And they were from the age of 26 to 60. And I had some arguments with some of them on a couple of occasions. Here we have old Tom. By the way, I believe we have 2 Toms in the class, is that right? 3. Well, my second name's Tom. I'd give you an atomic ache, wouldn't it? So, old Tom generates Bob, who generates Joe. Now, does he depend upon him for his generative action? No. He generates, Joe depends upon Bob for his existence, but Joe can generate, last week we buried Bob, and the week before we buried Tom. Joe can still generate. If they were dependent for their acts on generation upon another act of generation, you'd have to have all his ancestors generating in one room. So, forget I said that. Sorry about that. They'd all be generating at the same time. And that obvious absurdity. They're dependent upon the other for their existence. Or you certainly could probably take his act of generation and go in that direction and end up not back this way, not to Bob and Tom. But remember, all of these have to be present at the same time. These don't have to be present for Joe to be generated, or Bob does, but not Tom, nor the ancestors. They don't have to be present. So the act of generation is an accidental dependence. Like colour is an accidental being of the apple and gold. It's not the essence of gold. Well, this is accidental to his active existence. So his active that he is, and his do, his active generation, his active being and his active doing are two different acts. So
Why would you have three males and talk about generation?
Well, because it suits the occasion. See, there are only 3 women in this class tonight.
Yeah, but when I think of generation...
Yes, but it doesn't matter. I could take 3 women.
Yeah.
No, you only use an example, you usually use them, say, in some analogical way. You use the example only as it fitted to give the explanation, that's all.
Yeah, but that didn't help me, that's my point. Because there were 3 male names, or even if you had 3 female names,
Yeah.
well, that probably would make more sense, because women, forget it.
Only if you're in Toronto.
Pardon?
Only if you're in Toronto.
Only if you're in Toronto. No, but it's not necessary for the explanation. We're not talking about the view of marriage, and we're not concerned about the act of reproduction itself. We're concerned about the dependence. That's the thing we're focusing on.
But the word generative, what do you, help me with that then?
Reproduction. The act of generation is reproduction.
That's what I thought.
Pardon?
That's what I thought.
Yeah. Well, you're right. You're a big girl now. So there are the 2 principles explained. Whatever undergoes movement is moved by another, and in a series of essentially subordinated movers, there's no infinite regress. Aristotle pointed it out, and philosophers ever since have recognized that. In any act of causality, whether it's efficient causality or dependence of material causality or formal causality or final causality, there's no regress to infinity. You can't have an infinite series of causes, everything causing, unless you cannot prove it from this. Unless you take accidental dependence, then you can go on for infinitely if you wanted to. The principle of limited regress won't definitely apply to that if you go on infinitely. That's like the people who look at the stars and say, what a beautiful, beautiful, joyful heaven we've got. Yes, it's great. Oh, that proves there's a God. Yeah, but philosophers have condemned that. That just doesn't, you can't conclude from that. We'll see what you can conclude from that later. But we come to the 5th way. But you cannot prove something that there is definitely a God from just that general observation of magnificence and beauty like that. So we've got to remember that going from can move to does move is going from potency to act. And what we're doing, as you'll see on page 85, is we're shining the principles of reason, 2 of them, on this fact that there's movement, and drawing conclusion that a first cause of movement is. Not was, but is now. Because that movement is existing. Look, I can see you moving, a lot of you moving even now. So God exists now. Well, that first cause of movement exists, anyway, at least. So we see the fact, a weakness in human affairs, that things have to be moved. They can't move themselves. As I said, students say, what about the human body? What about animals? Well, this part moves part. The big dilemma for some people, like Luis Molina in Spain, was this. If God moves the will, the last moving thing in us, the ultimate, God moves the will, then we're not free. Luis Molina ran into that. He's been corrected this way. If I'm tied behind a car, I'm tied behind the wheel, I can't help it, I'm being pushed along by that car, but I can steer where I go. I've got freedom of steering. I'm being moved along. I can't not move the will, but I can decide where the will goes. That's where the will is driven by the intellect. Remember, I think we brought this out one night, the principle of reciprocity of causes. That causes are causes to each other in diverse order of causation. The intellect moves the will. The will moves the intellect. In the order of specification, I should have put that other arrow around here would have made more sense. It usually takes away a bit of the prejudice that could exist in that. The will is the driving power, the motive power, pushes the intellect. But the intellect specifies where it'll go. The principle of reciprocity of cause, reciprocal causes. For instance, the window opens. What drove the window to open? The wind. How did the wind get into the room? The opening of the window. Two different causes, two different modes, two different principles. The opening of the window let the wind in, but the wind caused the window to open. So causes can cause each other in different orders of causation. Yeah.
So where does affection come in? Does the affection come before the will, or are they the same?
The affection is the act of the will. That's an act of the will. So like the passion is an act of the sense appetite, the senses, our internal senses particularly. So it's there. We have powers of knowledge where we bring things into us, the world into us through knowledge, and we have the appetites that incline us out to things, love, the 11 basic passions, and the 11 affects of the will. We deal with that in greater depth in philosophical psychology. But the ultimate drive has to come from this first mover. Who's not moved to move. If there was any potency in him, he'd have to be moved from potency to act. He wouldn't be the first, it'd be somebody else who's first. So he's either the first, or if he's not, then he's not God. He's not the one we'd pay homage to. What does God mean, by the way? The word God means the one we pay homage to. The one we make sacrifices to. That's the meaning of the word. Now, the other races, Southern European races, that's more a Northern Germanic type of term for God. But the Southern people in Europe, they name him from the word for day in Latin. Dies. And dies, we get from that deity, the shiny one, the great brilliant one, the one that's dazzling, the one that causes the mouth to drop open, agape. That's the one, that's the way the others see him. We can only name him as we know him. We can't name him from anything else. All our words start from concrete things, and in some way we make them precise. Even the word for spirit, spirein in Greek, we have spirit, it means to breathe. We name spirit, the soul, as a spiritual being or a spiritual principle, incomplete being. We name that from this. It's like breath, something you can't grasp. That's what a spirit is, something you can't grasp. So that's how we name him, as a great spiritual being. And we have a lot more to say about that. We'll develop that later. We come to dealing with his properties. Yes?
In Greek, spirit is pneuma.
Yeah, I know that.
Oh, okay, because
Yeah.
you said spiritus.
Spirine, to breathe, yeah. It's one of the Greek terms. We'll argue that out later. So, the basic requirements then, the aim of the argument, on page 85. The aim of the argument is to show this, that there's something which is the cause of movement and is not moved itself. Cause of the movement is not moved itself. That's the aim of it. But we've got to face the fact of movement. And I've set each proof that I'm giving you, the whole 5 ways, I'm giving it to you I used to call it a popular form. So I think in the first couple there I've called it popular form. I call it now a simplified form in the later proofs. So I've argued this out here on page 86 in a simple way. The stone either gives itself the movement or receives it from another. If from itself, then it had it or gave it to itself. But if it did not have it, for it was not moving, it did not give it to itself because it did not have it to give it to itself. Otherwise, this would mean that it had it and did not have it at the same time. Contradiction. Therefore, in order to avoid absurdity, it must be said that the movement came from another. Moreover, it did not just come from itself, for then the greater would be coming from the lesser. Something would be coming from nothing. Think about that. Then look at the illustrations on page 86, for instance. The hand, the stick, and the stone. But try and grasp this. Move to move mover. That's the secret to it. It's a move to move mover. The stick and the hand. They're all move to move movers. But they're moved to move. They just don't move. They move to move. So I took a long time in my younger life, about 105 years ago, to grasp that move to move. And you see, if everything's being moved and being moved all over this, just the earth alone, my God, what greatness, what power. It's moving all other things which are moved to move. Every grain of sand, and we'll see presently, moved to be. Things are moved into be. So just take, as I've mentioned before, one beach. Just the waves coming in. Just that going on all the time. If you stood, as I have on so many times, at cliffs or on beaches, I was born on the coast in Australia, and watch the waves, you think, what enormous power there is there. Father Woodbury and I stood on the cliffs, Lover's Leap it's called, where we were. We stood watching one hot summer evening in Sydney, at Manly. We watched the waves, and he said, how could we ever harness this power? If only we could do that. It's the waves going. They're working on it now in lots of places. France, they're doing things. I flew over once. I was given the privilege of flying a four-seat Cessna, and the pilot sitting next to me kept a close eye on me, and over the Bay of Fundy. And the tide rises 50 feet. What power, if we could only put that together. But there's one being has got it together. He directs the lot. It's extraordinary, the power that's contained in it. So I've set out on page 87 for you the illustration of the cogs, the stairs, the train carriages, and the principle of limited regress, and explain that things are dependent, not for their existence, not for their colour, not for their shape, not for their hotness and coldness, but for the movement. St. Thomas takes specific things, the movement, which is given to it by something that went before it, something that preceded it. So that's the point, the critical point. If you could grasp this, a move to move mover gives the move, but is dependent upon something else giving it the move from potency to act. Potency and act, potency and act. Never forget that. So, can an actual series of movers exist? Well, what's the notion of infinite? That which is unfinished. Or, better way of putting it, no matter how much you take, there's more to come. Father can't think of his name for a moment. In Washington, D.C., he died in the last year or two. Wonderful man. He wrote the best book that's ever been written on the philosophy of the elements of education.
Miller?
Not Father Miller. He died. The other one that died before him, Dominican father, in the House of Studies where I stay once a year. He's, can't think of his name for a moment. And we discussed this, the notion of infinity. And he was relating to me, and I must confess I've forgotten exactly how he put it now, that many scientists have a notion of the infinite. And he said it's childish. They don't really grasp the notion of the infinite. But the notion is that no matter how much you take, there's more to come. It's never finished. Well, that doesn't explain movement. Doesn't explain anything. What happens there is that you've created a new problem. Because as I said, they're all receivers and nothing giving. They're all being moved, can't move themselves, but they're being moved by another. So the explanation is never in the thing itself, it's always in the one before it. And its explanation is not in it. It's not the one before it. So for an actual, now actual means finished. Actual means here and now. It's completed. It's a number, certain number. So that's utterly conflicting with the notion of infinite. That they're finished and yet they're not finished. If you deny the existence of God, my friends, you're led into absurdity no matter which way you turn. No matter which way you turn, you're involved deeply in absurdity, in contradiction. That's what I find so unforgivable in philosophers. And Dr. Bonnet and I we know such philosophers who brush aside the proofs of the existence of God. And as I've said to you before, how many times have I had this said to me, mainly by clergy, that those proofs are no longer valid. They're no longer valid. I've had that said again and again. And when I ask them, explain to me, why aren't they valid? Well, explain one of the proofs to me if you can't explain. Oh, well, I used to know them. We learned them in the seminary. Oh, good Lord, I'm talking about scholarship, not just ordinary undergraduate stuff. And we get nowhere with them. Just headstrong. One of my old classmates, he was the provincial of the Passionist order in a certain country, and he dropped dead at 40. He knows now. So the principle of limited regress expresses this simply, that no matter which way you go, you've got to ultimately arrive at a first cause of all those movements. On a beach, I've got one in mind, south of Sydney, where I lived. 7 Mile Beach. Now, the grains of sand, you can see them moving in the wind. Yet there's a mind controlling that. Each grain of sand. We'll see even worse than just controlling the movement presently. So there we go. In no member of this series, like all these grains of sand, all being moved, you see them moving about in the wind, or the water coming up on the beach, washing the grains of sand. All these movements, none of them have the explanation of the movement within themselves. If they were, they could not move. They'd be always moving. But they're not always moving. They go from can move to does move, potency to act. So none of them contain the explanation of the movement in itself, in this series or any other series like it. So Thomas puts it this way. Supposing I wanted to make a bed. You know, they'd make beds and make probably dressing tables or something, tables in his day. If I had a sufficient number of tools, I wouldn't need a carpenter. Now, nobody would accept that. He's showing how utterly absurd it is to suppose you've got an infinite series, therefore you don't need a first cause. It's surprising that some people would uphold such a statement. So it's just as silly to say, if you had a sufficient number of tools, you wouldn't need a carpenter. We could build a few houses like that, couldn't we, if we had enough tools? I'm sure that the value store would supply the tools. So for an infinite series passing from potency to act without anything actual causing the passage is absurd. It is quite evident that a spoon cannot move itself from can be hot to does be hot. That's absurd. And incidentally, Karl Marx, if you took Karl Marx literally, then you wouldn't need to put the kettle on to make coffee. The water will come to heat itself. And if you listen to David Hume, no movement would happen. We can't say that there's any movement in the stone is moving dependent upon the stick. We can observe no necessary connection. Yes, he's right, we cannot observe it, but we can understand it. Potency to act. So, I've outlined a couple of these things, some of these things for you, and I've given you diagrams such as on page 88. I've shown you accidentally subordinated series of movers and set that out there so that Sister can understand a little better about the birds and the bees and the flowers.
Ooh, picking on you.
So for these people that continue to claim there's no God, they break down into one or both of two fallacies, either that there isn't a finite regression, or that they don't believe in cause and effect. Can you call this cause and effect?
Oh, yes, yes. Definitely. You're arguing from effect. You notice this. This is an effect, the stone moving. Because the stone doesn't have movement in itself. Otherwise it would be never not moving. Now that's an effect. So from the effect you argue back to the cause.
So basically, as you say, they haven't given them thought because they're stuck either way.
Well, they get caught up in logic very often. They reword the words that they find, and they nearly always attack St. Thomas, by the way. And St. Thomas, the proofs were so well known in his day that he didn't need to elaborate them very much.
Well, that was
I'll give you copies of that later, but he didn't need to elaborate them because everybody knew them and understood them. And all the principles are there in the second question, third article of the Summa Theologiae. All the elements are there, but he did not elaborate on them because he knew by just mentioning the elements, everybody would know he's talking about potency and act.
Maybe you can clarify this for me. That he taught that in the scholastic era, they taught this and everyone understood it. But did they teach it based on the beginning of just logic with Aristotle, or did they approach it from more of a theological bent?
No, never to approach them for theological order. Read St. Thomas, you'll see that. He just sets out the philosophical elements. Aristotle's logic is the only logic. All the rest is, will I say it? Bullshitism. All the rest is just bullshitism. You see, modern logic is really based upon the conditional propositions. If so-and-so, then so-and-so. That's how it works. But even my friends who studied at the University of Sydney, who studied that, at graduate level, they didn't understand that how you could deny, or what could you force to necessary conclusions from that, depend upon the principle of non-contradiction. They didn't understand that. They don't understand traditional logic. You see, after, say, about the laxity in the 14th century, when there's a lot of nominalism and a lot of, some call it hair-splitting, useless distinctions being made and arguments, etc., and break up of the various schools and the Franciscans and the Dominicans, and etc., the traditional philosophy started to fall by the wayside. But it's as deeply involved with the human mind. The human mind thinks that way. And like a Jewish woman said to me, teaching with us in Ottawa when I was there at the University of Ottawa, she said, the trouble with Aristotelian logic, you can do nothing with it. I said, Diane, do you know Aristotelian logic? She said, no, I don't. My reply was, yes, I knew that before you said it. I mean, they don't understand it. My friend Rick McKern, who was a lawyer studying with me at the Aquinas Academy in Australia, Rick said, this contemporary logic, he said, only seems to fit into a narrow slot of things, as it were. And it's all very, it doesn't take into account all sorts of things, like the supposition of verbs and all sorts of things. And the nature of the universal, they don't know about that. They'll live from a group of particulars and think that's a universal. They had no idea of the nature of the universal. And consequently, they will deny the traditional logic, but they don't know what it is. It's magnificent. The Periomenias of Aristotle. We had to, at graduate level, do one course with Father Martinelli on the commentary of St. Thomas on Aristotle's Periomenias, which is one of the books of Aristotle's logic. And in that, Aristotle deals with the judgment, and St. Thomas comments on that. It's magnificent. The judgment, remember, is the highest mark of the human intellect. Aristotle said, he who judges well is wise. Judgment is the ultimate of human knowledge. The first act of the intellect, simple apprehension. Then the second act is judgment. The third act is reasoning. But reasoning's only to get to new judgments. Oh, I apologise, we've gone over time. We'll take a quick break.
There's